When I first started photography a bit over a year now, I tried to learn from anywhere that I could find, whether it's here on YouTube or even in books. In the midst of all these rules and guidelines and instructions to follow a specific thing blindly, there was one thing that tended to stand out a lot, and I started to incorporate that more and more into my photos. And at the beginning, I would try to follow this as much as I could, and when it came down to my composition, I would try to make sure that they were only odd numbered in them. But after a couple of months, I started to realize what was leading me astray in that, and I started to develop better and better photos, incorporating that rule even better. And where it all started, which is what I want to talk about in this video, is why the rule of odds works, or at least seems to work. What is it about it? When should we break it? When should we not break it? And what it actually changes about the composition that tends to make the photo look better. Because it's first understanding how the rule works and why it works so well when it does, that we can start to use it more selectively in determining our composition. And so let's start off with why this rule even exists. Because there's a reason when these guidelines become rules. They're used so often and they tend to produce images on reflection of those images that we tend to associate rules with whatever that pattern might be. So based on what I've learned, I think the rule of odds tends to work primarily because it breaks the symmetry while still maintaining a form of symmetry. So let me explain that a little bit better. When you have four different objects in a straight line, you tend to perceive the image as symmetrical. If you divide the entire image into half, it would appear to be symmetrical. But the problem with that is when you divide it into half, there's no specific place where attention is going to be drawn. But let's say you add a fifth element into, you are still left with a symmetrical image. The difference is that now with this symmetry, the item in the center will tend to have more attention because it stands out as something that is odd out. And so this highlights what this rule of odds tends to do, which is brings attention to the image. In this era of individualism and uniqueness where we try and show our authentic self and stand out from everyone else, we are particularly drawn to those odd numbered things because one of those elements will tend to stand out and appear more vibrant against all the other elements in the image. So now that we know that odd numbered things can be used to draw attention to a certain subject, it's important to realize that there's still a lot of nuances with that. You can't just, like me, what I was doing before, put odd numbered elements in your photo and expect it to look good. If you look at any of these photos, sure, they were at a time when I didn't have other skills, which is balancing light or editing well or figuring out what other compositional elements I need to use. I was focused primarily on trying to incorporate 3 or 5 or odd numbered things of whatever it was that was there, and it didn't end up too well. So one thing to know is that the concept of oddness is perceived. You don't necessarily need to have odd numbered elements in the photo. It's what the viewer will perceive as odd numbered elements. So if you have a group of people clustered together, that will be perceived as one. If you have two groups of people clustered in separate groups, that will actually be perceived as two. You don't need to individually go and count all the different people in all the different groups and come up with an odd number. It's what the viewer, when they're looking at it, will perceive as a certain element in that photo. I know I've used objects and elements interchangeably before, but I hope it's clear what I mean now. And if not, let me share a few pictures to better showcase what it is that I actually mean. If you take a look at these photos, no one's actually going to spend time to count all the different elements, and you can't even perceive all the different elements in terms of how many there actually are. But for example, for this photo, we have a bird in the middle, and then there's 5 pylons, one that the bird is standing on, and then 4 around it. Because the 5 pylons in the front are semi-separated from the others because of the gap of the water, and the ones at the back are more clustered together, those can be treated as a separate part of the image. And because the fifth pylon is in the middle and the bird is on top of that, we tend to focus our attention on that. If you take a look at this photo doesn't even use the rule of odds because there are just so many trees and it's hard for our eyes to perceive what those trees are. You could think about it as the number of layers, right? So there's the dark grassy layer, then there's lighter grassy layer, and then there's the trees. So those are 3 different layers for this photo. But those individual objects, which are the trees, don't stand out as individual elements. I would even say that they are just one element. And what this brings me to is the next point, which is even numbered things, if they create enough of a concentration of attention to one and the other elements are used to enhance the attention to the other, can create a similar effect to this rule of odds. So if you take a look at these photos, we see that the lily pad, one of them stands out and there's 3 other on the side. Now, if there was another grouping of lily pads above in this empty space, it might still work out really well. But I think for this photo, it still works well even with this, because I think there's distinct attention to the individual element if you consider just the element on the right, or if you considered all the 4 different items as individual elements. Now for this photo, it's obvious what the subject is. It's the tree in the center. And we can see 2 more trees in the back. So there are 3 elements. But now there's also a tree on the side, which adds a 4th element. But this photo still works really well with the same principle of drawing attention, because the subject in the back can be treated all as very similar to one another because they have the same level of transparency in the photo. Because of other compositional techniques that I've used here, which is the difference in depth and creating depth perception. Now for this photo, there are 3 elements. I would say the tree in the center is obviously the main element, but there's an element in the front, which is the grass, and then there's an element in the back with the trees as well. Now, those elements might or might not be considered strong enough, but their only objective is to actually draw attention to this one tree. So if I can make that one tree stand out more, it doesn't really matter how many other elements I have around it, as long as they're not distracting. Because if I had 10 different elements, they might end up being distracting if those tend to stand out more. Now this is a photo that I really enjoy taking, and you can see that the main attention is drawn to that goose in the center with the sunlight shining on top of it. That really highlights that goose. But now let's count the number of elements. There are, I would say, 4 elements in that region, right? So there's 3 different groupings of geese, and then there's the one goose in the center. And the reason we don't perceive it as being too boring is because of that highlight in the center. Now, if that highlight wasn't there and the goose wasn't in the center, then it might not stand out as well. And the fact that the goose is by itself, while all the other clusters are separated from that main goose in the center, and there are also multiple geese in all of those different clusters, makes that one goose stand out a lot more, making it so that the same principles of using the odds for creating this highlighting effect on that one goose works. But remember that even with even numbered photos which are very obvious, such as this one, right? There's only 2 trees, they both have the same level of depth, they both have the same level of focus in that photo. Sure, one of them is further off to the right, but they're still the main attention. So how does this photo work? It's because we don't treat those 2 different trees as 2 different elements. Because those trees aren't too separated, we can still combine them as one single element and use that to formulate the composition of the photo. So let's take a look at something else, which is if we do have odd numbered elements in our photos, how do they end up working so well and what type of stories we can tell with it? Because although the odd numbered elements in the photo will help that photo stand out more, we can still use this perception of odd numbers being more interesting to create different types of photos. So for example, for this image, I have 3 different sunflowers in this photo that are the main subjects. And the reason I was drawn so much to this composition was because they showed 3 different, I guess, aging within the sunflowers, and that kind of reflected life in my opinion. And although there's no one specific sunflower that stands out, the only reason this photo works is if all 3 of those sunflowers are there, it still works well, and I'm able to create a story with this. Now, because there's only 3 main sunflowers, they tend to create a more engaging photo without requiring one of the elements being more standing out than the others. Now, with this photo, I'm not using actual elements in the photo. I'm using the perception that there is a 3rd element in the photo. So we know that the one in the center has to be the main subject, the main leaf, because the one off in the top left corner is too far away, it's too isolated, too much out of the center. And there's another one which is definitely out of the frame of the photo, but we can recognize that there is a cluster right there. So the one in the center has to be the one, even though there are 2 other leaf clusters around it. Compared to this photo, where even though we have 3 really identifiable clusters, we don't really identify the main subject because there is nothing in the center. All of them are off to the side, and the place where our eyes are drawn to is the dark spot in between, which isn't really a strong enough subject. And so even though we've used rule of odds here, and it's a very similar photo to the previous one, but because we have created this effect where there's no specific cluster that our eyes can get drawn to, that photo tends to not be strong enough. Now for this photo, we can identify that the deer in the center is the main deer because it is in the center of that 3 deer in the front. But the reason this photo works so well is because that extra emphasis placed on that center deer, because it's different than the 2 deer around it. So even though we've used 3 different elements, which are the 3 different deer, the fact that those other 2 deer aren't looking up as well really enhances the attention on that 1 deer. But you see how even with the rule of odds, we've created this extra attention on the main deer that we want to draw our attention to anyways. In this photo, you see a lot of the things that I talked about before, how clusters get perceived as one element rather than all the individual objects within that cluster. We can see that there's actually 3 different clusters in this photo. There's the big cluster, then there's a middle cluster, and then there's 1 sheep off to the side. And because that 1 sheep is by itself and off to the side, we don't draw our attention to the one in the center. We draw our attention to the cluster or the 1 sheep on the very right. Even though it's not exactly in the center, this notion of drawing attention by differentiating yourself from the other sheep by being much more off to the side and being by yourself really enhances the effect of this photo. But even though we've identified the power of the rule of odds in really identifying and enhancing the attention to the subject, it doesn't always work, and there are a lot of times when you might not even want to use it. There's a lot of times when you want more symmetry in your photo because that is the type of effect you want to go for. There are other times when you really want to focus on the pattern of the photo and you don't really care about how many different elements there are. A lot of the times when we create abstract photos, we are focused more on the pattern and the flow of the patterns in the photo rather than the actual number of elements in the photo. We're not really focused on using the rule of odds to enhance that focus. We're more focused on using the pattern of that subject to really enhance the photo and create the aesthetic appeal that we're going for. So I hope this video helped you understand what it is about the rule of odds that works so well and why it works so well. Now you can use it as a guideline and always incorporate only odd numbered things, but I would say that would make your photography a lot more rigid and prevent you from actually being more creative. So take the lesson from this video about what the rule of odds actually tries to do and then identify other ways in trying to accomplish that same effect. All right, I'll see you next time.